get started with the next session. If you'd all take your seats, please. We'll get into kind of a formal overview of the overall theme of the program. But as you all know, we're here to discuss one of the biggest initiatives and challenges we're facing as a community, which is this drive towards efficiency. And one of the most prevalent ways that we've come to believe that efficiency can be achieved is through cloud computing. And while there's no doubting the benefits that the cloud brings, as we start to move services and infrastructures and storage and applications to the cloud, that means that all of you are starting to give up control of your data and ultimately of security. And that is a pretty scary concept, understandably so. There's really two elements to making sure that your strategies are, sorry, I lost my train of thought. There's really two ways that we need to ensure that I have to start over, excuse me. Basically, to overcome this security challenge that we have, it all comes down to trust. There's really two phases to this. There is the first phase where you're building the contracts and scoping out the SLAs, and needs to make sure that that is done correctly. After that, once the services are launched, it then comes down to monitoring and ensuring that the cloud vendors are ultimately delivering the levels of security that you have asked for and scoped out in the contracts or SLAs. And so what we've done today is bring together a couple executives from different parts of the government who have different perspectives, privacy, operations, and policy and research, to really address this whole notion of developing trust with your cloud vendor. To that end, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off, giving each of the executives an opportunity to introduce themselves and give you the background knowledge of where they'll be speaking from. I want to start off by saying we do have some questions that have been submitted to us that we developed as a team, as well as submitted from the audience already, but we do want this to be extremely interactive. So please feel free to engage, ask questions, and the panelists are really here to give their insights and expertise based on their various backgrounds. So with that, I'm going to start off with Jerry to introduce himself.
Thank you, Martin. It's good to be back here. I was here last year, and I have to tell you, this is really a neat forum. It's action-packed, a lot of good information, a lot of dialogue, and I'm sure we're going to have that again today. And it's a real joy to participate on the panel with my colleague Fred. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at the Department of Energy, and I can tell you there's never a dull day in the area of privacy. Often I say that privacy is like running a fire department. There's really no good news about it. Eventually the alarm's going to go off. You just hope that the fire department's trained, you got the equipment, you got people that know what they're doing, especially if it's your household fire. They're going to show up, they're going to know what to do. You're going to have confidence in them. But an organization, and I just want to footnote a couple of things for the sake of the discussion here. For cloud service providers, I'm just going to use the term vendors. So vendors for however you define a cloud service provider. And then organizations, I'm going to use that term for federal agencies, state agencies, academia, financial institutions. So the goal is that you're going to have a vendor that really understands the dynamics of cloud. So the theme is trust but verify. You've got to have trust in the vendor before you make the decision to enter into an agreement, whether it's in terms of service agreement or a contract. My preference, and I'll talk a little bit more about it and the reasons for it, my preference is that the agreement should be memorialized in the four corners of a contract for a lot of reasons. And in order to do that, in order to gain that trust, it requires a multidisciplinary team in the organization consisting of counsel, records managers, cybersecurity folks, privacy. You got to bring all the right types together to ensure that you do your due diligence the right way and you get all the information that you need and that will be used in crafting the language of the agreement. Hopefully it's the terms of service agreement. So it's a really exciting time in privacy. I mean, we've got a lot of initiatives in the government. Beyond push to the cloud, we have social media. Think about 3 years ago, using YouTube, Facebook, Energy Department. You ask the CEO, can we do that? One word, two letters? No, for a lot of reasons. But we're all using social media. Bring your own device to work. It's a good concept, but when you start thinking about it, cyber privacy concerns raise this issue. So Today in the discussion, my path is really privacy, obviously cybersecurity and other concerns will be discussed, but what I'm going to engage in is a discussion on privacy implications and what can be done to mitigate risk and privacy as an organization makes a decision to migrate to the cloud. And with that, I turn it back.
Great, thank you. Next up, Colleen.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Colleen Coggins, and I'm the Chief Information Officer for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We're a small operating administration within the Department of Transportation, and I say small because we're small in FTE. We only have about 600 FTE, but our mission spans, of course, the entire nation and touches the American public daily. Anytime you get into your vehicle, we are the organization that regulates the automotive manufacturers and ensures that the cars that we drive on our highways are safe and sound for our families. So we have a situation where for our computing infrastructure, we, dependent upon what's in the news, and sometimes we are very visible in the news. Many of you may have heard reference to NHTSA during Toyota's sudden unintended acceleration. Now it's the Chevy Volt. So anytime a big potential vehicular defect is front and center, then typically we are in the news, aka our websites are being hit tremendously. And some of our back-end application systems are being accessed very frequently. So the volume increase goes up. Depending upon what's, again, front and center with our agency. And so that means that cloud computing is very attractive to us because, as you probably know, one of the advantages to cloud is on-demand scalability. And so our ability to harness computing power at the need, basically, is very attractive. It's just cost prohibitive for us to procure and operate an infrastructure that meets peak all the times that we need that processing capability. So we have ventured into the cloud environment. This last year, we ventured into a public cloud facility, and I'm here to share with you some of the lessons learned, both contractually, service level agreement wise, and of course security wise, in terms of how we have implemented and are monitoring in terms of the Trust but Verify model, our cloud computing infrastructure. And as Jerry just alluded to, ensuring that all of these things are defined up front in your contracts is very critical in terms of sustainability and ensuring that you have a leg to stand on in case those metrics are not met, that you have a leg to stand on in terms of damages or resolution with your cloud service provider. So I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to having an engaging discussion with you.
And Mr. Fred Webster.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Fred Whiteside. Over the last 2 years, I've had the pleasure of serving under Don Leith at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, on the Federal Cloud Computing Program. I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with a lot of the guidance that comes out of NIST. The Cloud Computing Program, one of their primary deliverables was the Standards and Technology Roadmap. Last April that it was actually published. And the working group that I chair, which was the security working group, finally released the final draft of the 500-296 document, which is entitled Challenging Security Requirements for the U.S. Government Adoption of Cloud Computing. This document was unique from a NIST perspective. It was unique in that it was a very practical look at cloud security. In other words, we took sort of a what's keeping you up at night approach to developing this document, and in conjunction with the private sector, we were able to identify 17 requirements that we felt were which we seem to find, I should say, were critical to the adoption of cloud computing across the federal government. Privacy was, of course, one of the requirements. Operational security with regard to continuous monitoring, some of the things that Colin touched on. Roles and responsibility, I think that we'll probably talk about just a little bit later on. And we also talked quite a bit about FedRAMP, which I really don't want to get into in a whole lot of great detail, but I think most of us are relatively familiar with it. But FedRAMP creates a few challenges as well as answers and solves a number of problems in that it creates a security baseline and federal managers can look out across this group of ATOs that may exist among cloud providers and sort of pick and choose those services that they feel are best suited to their environments. There are some other challenges with FedRAMP. I think we all are well familiar with its shortcomings, but I think as far as just like any other federal program, I think it does more good than harm, certainly. And we'll talk about how a little bit more about some of the benefits of that program and its baseline and what to do. I think you touched on it earlier about when you mentioned SLAs, what to do to go above and beyond what FedRAMP provides.
Absolutely. Great. And to kick it off, I want to ask one general question which came up a lot during the research process, and it goes back to that word I tried to get out earlier and had a problem with, which is the word of trust. And I want to understand and get your perspectives on why do you think it is, so difficult to establish trust with vendors? And secondly, what can we do at a very high level to start to build trust in the relationships from the get-go? And I know it's obviously it's a relationship, really, the word gives the impression of a long duration, so trust has to be developed at every stage of that process. So what's your thoughts around that?
Well, first, it's important. You've got to have trust and confidence in a vendor before you make a decision to push data to them. My experience, it requires a lot of communication, situational awareness. You have to first understand what your strategy is for an organization. The threshold question is, are you going to go to a public, cloud, private, hybrid, something thereof, combination? Second question, does the collection of data contain personal information? There's many cases where a push to the cloud may consist of data that has no personal information. But the person that's certified in the organization, they must understand how the background and the information to make that certification that there's no personal information. In many cases, you want to err on the side that there is personal information and ensure that the agreement addresses privacy concerns. And then third, after you address those questions, it requires action. And this is the hard part. In my experience, this is the part or the things that doesn't happen too well. And it's the process of documenting due diligence. And you have to go in and believe in both parties working in good faith. And the goal is to have a meeting of the mind between the vendor and the organization, especially if you're not going through GSA FedRAMP. You know, they just announced they have 9 third-party assessors going to do the work for you. You may choose not to do that. You may want to do it yourself. So you have to understand what questions to ask, have that multidisciplinary team I mentioned earlier, legal counsel, federal records. Typically for the federal side, you got to look at e-discovery, both sides, public, private sector, cybersecurity, both private, public sector, and of course, privacy. I would be sitting at the table and we would be assessing privacy considerations. And we would be documenting our concerns. So in the communication with the vendor, we would gain that trust and confidence that they've actually thought about it. Some of the areas that you would want to consider to gain trust is whether or not, in the event there's a incident, the push to the cloud is going to contain personal information. In the event of an incident, a breach, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to notify whom? Who's responsible? And in so many cases, agreements, whether terms of service agreement or contract, it was silent. And the worst time to find out about it is after the event, because the vendor's essentially going to say, it's not in the agreement. So the organization is going to end up funding a lot of activity it did not plan to expend on. So another area is mergers, acquisitions, bankruptcy. You have to think through the process. If you push your data to a vendor and something happens, they merge to another company, or they at the verge of bankruptcy, what's going to happen to the data? Ownership of the data. How can they use the data? Can they share it with third parties? So training with respect to the vendor employees that's closely connected to the information. Auditing for the organizational side. Will the organization have the ability to go in and audit? And don't be afraid to use that word. If it's clear in the contract that you as the owner of the information has the authority to go in with requisite skill sets to audit to ensure that the vendor's doing what they're supposed to based on the four corners of the contract, that's a good thing. But to gain that trust, the reason why it's so hard is that in a lot of cases, the push to get the information to the cloud, that's the overarching priority. And the entity that's managing the push from the organization, sometimes they're from an area that they don't, an office where they haven't thought through these other issues. They may be from IT, so they're not thinking about e-discovery. They're not thinking about a freedom of information request. Even though it's in the cloud, you still have a responsibility to reach out and pull that data based on statutory time frame. So the vendor's got to understand that, and the contract's got to be clear on that. So the most time-consuming part of this is before you get to the negotiation stage. You've done your due diligence, it's documented. Hopefully you're going to use that to translate it into contract terms with your contracting officer, because he or she, contracting officers are great, especially on the federal side, but they're not subject matter experts. They know how to do a FOR contract, but you've got to tell them the special language beyond the four boilerplates that you want to see in the contract. If you see resistance from a potential vendor, then you know there's a problem. They haven't thought about privacy, that they can't answer anything, so they're going to steer away. But a vendor who really has thought through this, especially if they monitor FedRep, their criteria to obtain certification, they're going to have answers. They're going to look you in the face. They're going to tell you they understand privacy. They're going to tell you if the Privacy Act applies to the collection, and in some cases pushing data to the cloud may require Privacy Act protections. And as you know, Privacy Act penalties apply to the contractors so long as it's in the four corners of the contract. They're going to demonstrate that they have confidence. And by you going through their protocols to protect your data, you're going to gain that confidence. At the same time, they're going to gain confidence in the customer. So at the end of the day, it's really about obtaining a meeting of the mind between the vendor, who has a big stake in this, and the customer, who has an even larger stake. And if you do it right, that's your insurance policy. And I can tell you right now, there's a likelihood there's going to be an incident. Hopefully it's a minor incident, but if it's catastrophic, and if you're in the government, the Congress picks up on it, or private sector media picks up on it, you can demonstrate that as an organization, that you did your due diligence, you had policy, you had training, you had the contract with proper language, and the proximate cause of the incident was insider threat, bad actor. Typical case that I'm familiar with, a really good employee who had a bad day and compromised data. The proximate cause is not a lack of policy, contractual language. It's just, it happens, and you can survive that. But if you have that agreement, there was no trust, there was no confidence, and the contract doesn't really spell out the boundaries, the rules of engagement before you push the data, it's going to be a bad situation all the way around. So again, trust is hard to get, trust and confidence, but through that due diligence process with the right people, documenting, asking the right questions, taking the time to ensure that everything's on the table, leverage your contracting officer to ensure that that data is in that contract, you can't go wrong. You're going to probably have an incident, but you can survive it.
Great, thank you. And Colleen, from an operational point of view, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think like any relationship, trust is earned, and so your relationship with your cloud service provider, you should go in with the notion that you don't take their security controls for granted, and so even when you are in the acquisition strategy phase and when you're looking at different options, you want to ensure that you structure your requirements such that they're very explicit and that the cloud service provider understands and knows what the expectations are, and obviously that they are vetted to ensure that they can meet them. Again, past behavior is a good indicator, just like in any relationship, whether or not trust should be established with this future partner of yours. And so past experience in the same venue with customers that you can contact and verify that yes, monitoring is accurate, the monitoring, the security devices, the intrusion detection systems, the IPSs, that you have access to those near real time. In the event something looks awry, that your incident management procedures are contacted, your personnel are contacted so that your incident management functions can, again, take off in terms of handling whatever situation is at hand. So those things, I think, need to be spelled out. Procedures need to be documented. Just like any testing, they need to be COOP tested. And so there's a series of activities that you want to do to ensure that trust is not only established from day one, but also in the continuous monitoring aspect that you are, in conjunction with your service provider, having access to the logs and monitoring those on a continuous basis. One of the things that we've done within NHTSA is to negotiate with our cloud service provider, and I understand this is not really routine, but we've negotiated our own GFE, IDS, and IPS monitoring devices at the layer 3 network level. So it's interesting, we're buying these managed services, secure services from our cloud provider, but again, it's their equipment, it's their personnel, and so yes, there still is that trusted relationship, but we're looking at an independent monitoring and an evaluation of our logs from our GFE, our snort versus their snort, if you will, in terms of looking at any potential variances. We do have a low impact system application in the cloud. I say impact in terms of risk. It does not have this PII in terms of structured data, but we do have some open text field where potentially there could be inserted some PII information. And so we're in the process of even including a PII detection device for potential PII leakage that we would be notified, and again, through the monitoring, continuous monitoring, to determine whether or not there is some leakage, and of course, initiating whatever incident management activities are necessary at the time. So I think, again, the message would be trust is earned. There's really some due diligence on both parts to ensure that it is at the level that is appropriate with your organization and the sensitivity of your data, and that it is ongoing, monitored throughout the partnership that you have with your cloud provider.
Thank you. And Fred, you have a unique perspective of working with a lot of different types of organizations and contractors. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I do have a slightly different perspective. I'm glad that you provided, and you said, and talked about something that was really important, operational. Because I think that a majority of the trust, or lack of trust, that exists is because organizations don't know that they can do these things. Jerry mentioned different deployment models. For example, there's this thought that if I put my information in the public cloud, that it's somehow less secure than it would be in some private cloud. And unfortunately, that has led a lot of federal organizations to say, okay, well, if we have a cloud-first policy, we have to put information in the cloud. So I'm going to go out and buy some hardware, some software, and some floor space, and I'm going to build a cloud right here in my data center. Well, the idea was to get out of that data center business, right? So the idea is that federal managers don't understand that there is quite a bit of security if done properly, if with properly structured SLAs, and with consultation with your procurement office and legal, your information will be perfectly secure. So I say that to say that I think a large part of the whole trust barrier is perceived. And we really discovered this in some of our research in the development of that 296 document. There was, I think that, you know, once FedRAMP finally launched and people began to see that here's a mechanism that really establishes a set of security controls, a baseline for continuous monitoring, and now that they understand, or beginning to understand that these things exist, I think that the confidence is beginning to grow across the federal government. But I think we started off with this perception that, oh my God, I'm putting my information out on the internet where the whole world can see it. And that is, you know, nothing could obviously be further from the truth. Now, having said that, I sat in a near 6-hour capabilities brief with a major cloud vendor who shall remain nameless. And basically, they said, well, if you need to see and review log data, unfortunately, that's a requirement we can't meet. Well, that would be a showstopper for me, and I think most federal managers who have any kind of operational background whatsoever at all. And I think that Colleen just spelled out clearly that there are ways that can be accomplished. So yes, some of the vendors, there is some pushback with regard to how much access you have to security information, log data, and so on and so forth. But the strength of that and the remedy for that scenario is requirements. I can't say it enough. Strong development of requirements, understanding your own requirements, and development of sound SLA. Can't be.
Well, it's interesting to hear all of you talk. The other day I was speaking with Bob, who we'll be talking to later tonight, and he mentioned that in a lot of these meetings that he's going to on security, it's a bunch of lawyers these days. And I think it comes down to the fact that it's all about contracts. And as you're starting to move into these new infrastructure models, it really comes down to not just the technology that's being used, but how these contracts are being written to empower you to do the type of things that Colleen is doing, that you're talking about doing, and that Jerry's talking about doing. Interesting. Jared, to that point, going back to privacy, I think everyone's mentioned how the importance of the role privacy plays. What are some of the issues that organizations should address when migrating to the cloud from a privacy perspective?
Again, I keep going back to the due diligence, documenting that due diligence, translating that to preferably 4 corners of the contract. Contract's better because typically you're not going to have a post-award change, whereas terms of service agreement, it's very routine that the vendor will post-agreement make unilateral changes, and you constantly got to be reviewing the policy. My lane, my area of concern is privacy, but it happens. The contract's very important. Just mentioned that Army of Attorneys are looking at the nature of the contracts, whether the federal acquisition rate should have standard boilerplate clauses with respect to privacy. I think there's a need for that. But specificity is very important. When it comes down to it, everybody's happy. The vendor and the organization is happy until there's an incident. And with respect to my line of fire would be a privacy incident. And that's when you're going to get into finger pointing. You're going to have to go back to something. If it goes to litigation, they're going to look at the 4 corners of the terms of service agreement or the contract. And I think a well-constructed contract is going to give an organization what they need, public or private sector. And some of the things you would want to address in the contract. Again, we touched on perhaps the most important, which is something no one wants to talk about. But if there's an incident, who's responsible for what? There's timelines on the federal side for reporting incidents. And there's timelines with respect to notifications. You have to start the discussion hoping that the organization is aware of that. They've got privacy expertise. The leadership understands privacy is important, and it's given the requisite resources it needs. It has a sounding platform to make certain that when you're leaning forward to pushing data to the cloud, that the privacy person is at the table, helping to put risk on the table, helping with language to mitigate the risk, and the breach notification part's really important. Data location is another area that's of importance for privacy and legal counsel. If the data is going to be stored outside the continental United States, could be issues. Some countries have very, very aggressive privacy laws. European Union, top of the list. Canada, close second. Australia, great privacy laws. But there are some areas where there are no privacy protections. So you have to spell out, you've got to make it clear in the contract, full disclosure. If the data storage is in the continental United States and subsequent to the agreement, you decide that you're going to move the data elsewhere for whatever reason, typically a financial justification, they must notify the owning organization. Otherwise, you may find that your data is in a place that you don't want it to be. And that has to be spelled out. There's been a couple of incidents whereby data, after the agreement was signed, it was moved. And I think the vendor may have known that it was going to move. And the attorneys have to make sure that the legal jurisdiction, the forum, the conflict of law issues is well addressed, and that's done up front. Training is another important area, especially if the Privacy Act applies to the cloud collection. There's requirements that the employees associated with the system of record, the Privacy Act system of record, they're trained. And that has to be spelled out in the contract. The frequency of the training, the nature of the training, who's going to give the training, whether or not the vendor has to certify to the owning organization that the training was done. Not to do that is a violation of the Privacy Act. On the federal side, on the public side, distinction, you have state laws you have to follow. If you have health records involved in HIPAA, it's going to be the governing statute. More stringent than the Privacy Act. That applies to private sector, public sector, academia. It's universal. So understanding what type of PII is going to the cloud, determining whether any special statutory requirements is attached to that collection. For personal information, generally it's the Privacy Act, the series of OMB memos in the government sphere, health records, again, HIPAA. There's some financial records, but there's some very nuanced, very narrow statutes with respect to storage of those records. And that's why I go back to that multidisciplinary team that's sitting at the table within the organization, communicating with the lead that's in charge of pushing to the cloud, giving him and her the information they need. They're not subject matter experts in all of these areas. So again, it's talking about gaining trust early on. It's the part that most organizations, they bypass. They just push it out there, hope it goes well, and then when you start having problems, then all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, that multidisciplinary team would have been nice. And had we translated that data to the four corners of a contract, we would be okay. Student perhaps have an incident, but again, you demonstrate due diligence, and the proximate cause of the incident would be typically a good employee, bad day, but not that the organization didn't think through something.
Great. One final question before we open it up to the audience. Colleen, when we had our planning call a few weeks ago, you had talked about Trust but Verify model. I was wondering if you could share with the group what that is and how it applies to cloud-based security services.
Sure. Well, just to expand on the type of cloud service that we are procuring infrastructure as a service, so everything from the operating system to the application is NHTSA applications. We are obviously responsible for testing and validation of the NIST 853 controls for each of those layers. The network perimeter, the security network perimeter, we are reliant upon our cloud service provider, obviously, their IDS, their intrusion protection system. And again, they have their own equipment, their own devices, their own configuration of those devices and monitoring tools, which we have access to in terms of logs. We, again, negotiated at layer 3 of the network to install our own devices so we can have a comparative analysis that we can examine their logs versus ours to see if there's any variance. Now, we're just starting this. This is something new, and typically, my understanding is this is a bit out of the ordinary. So I think it's a little bit groundbreaking in terms of this independent monitoring, that we can look at their information versus ours, and if there is any variance, sit down and discuss it and determine whether or not we need to take action from what we're seeing. So that's the Trust but Verify. There's other additional tools, as I mentioned. We purchased a tool called Data Guys that does PII sniffing, which is a managed security service that was not offered by our cloud vendor. We, again, are looking at installing that to determine whether or not there is any leakage of PII. So I think there's things that can be done technically, procedurally, and of course, all of this should be based in the SLA and or contract that you have established. Negotiate the terms of how you're going to interchange with your service provider are key and most important up front, so you don't have these major issues, if you will, once you have signed on the dotted line. And thankfully, we've been able to have some successful negotiations when something pretty evident in terms of change has occurred procedurally. We've established a contract mod and, again, just put the right tenants, if you will, in place so that we can have a informed relationship in terms of responsibilities and roles and segregation of the duties.
Colin, I'm curious, you mentioned a few times that this model you have is pretty unique, and I think Fred agreed with that. Why do you think was it the communication was different? Was it the philosophy of the vendor? What's the catalyst here that made this so possible?
Well, I think, again, it's trust is earned,
Mm-hmm.
and so, perhaps we're a little bit more cautious, maybe. This is our first foot in the pool in terms of cloud services, and I think, whenever you're doing negotiations with any contractual partner, you should push the envelope in terms of what-if scenarios that are to your advantage. And if they are in agreement with that, particularly in a pilot standpoint, and they can sell that potentially as an added assurance to other federal agencies coming down the pipe, then I think then it's potentially a win-win. So they had some, I think, incentive, if you will, for potential future clients to move forward on that.
Interesting. We have a host of other questions we could ask, but I definitely want to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions here. Are there any questions from you at this time? This came up a lot during research, so I know. Oh, here we go. Go ahead.
Colleen, I wonder a little bit more on that Trust but Verify model. Were there particular incidents that led you to request the dual monitoring, or what do you expect might lead to variances? Are you using similar tools or dissimilar tools? I wonder if you could talk a little bit on what you expect, what do you problems?
Well, thankfully, our first year was uneventful, so that's always good. We did not have any incidents that raised the awareness in terms of warranting that we put these in place, but I think it was more the cautionary standpoint to be proactive in ensuring that the data that we were receiving, again, that we could validate through independent monitoring of our own equipment, that in fact we were seeing similar, let's just say potential, if there were potential intrusions, that we were picking them out alongside with our vendors. So thankfully there was nothing that, no pre-incident, if you will, that pointed us to put this in place. I have a very cautious information system security officer, frankly, and this really was his idea. I have to give him the bulk of the credit. And it was something that I think was, like I said, a win-win from the service provider as a potential model that other agencies might be interested in.
If I could, Colleen's organization was just one who really took the initiative to make sure that they documented their own requirements and were very forceful and really adhered to them. Remember that right now, a vast majority of the federal organizations who have cloud implementations did so probably 7, 8, 9 months to a year or so ago. And there was a lot of unknowns. I mean, if you, whether you agree with it or not, Vivek Kundra, I think, had the right idea in forcing organizations to sort of stick that toe in the water, right? But they're going to make mistakes. Organizations didn't know to take the steps that Collins organization did. So now they have an opportunity to go back, and particularly now that FedRAMP has launched, that changed the dynamic quite a bit. So now that this has happened, organizations have an opportunity to go back now and take a look at those SLAs and modify them and understand now that they, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, to a large degree with security. There are some that are rigid. If you remember, I don't mean to beat up on them, but Amazon, there was an article about how Amazon basically, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but they basically said, listen, we're giving you fast, efficient service and it's going to save your bundle. Security is your problem. But of course, obviously, they back away off of that now. They're as good as anybody with regard to security. Why? Because they understood that it was an absolute requirement, and it's like buying a used car. If you don't ask, right? And that is the unfortunately the dynamic with some cloud providers. Not all of them are that way, but and some will help you in that regard. But it's very, very important that organizations take the time to that painstaking, but we hate to do it, but it's a painful process at times. But that security requirements development effort is certainly worthwhile.
And just to add to that, we are very, very pleased that FedRAMP is officially launched. I think, anytime you have the best and brightest security experts across the federal government looking at the service providers and, again, standardized in terms of the methodology on how they're testing and doing the documentation of each of the NIST 853 controls, I think, again, we all benefit. It is the cost savings alone in terms of being able to look at these ATOs and reuse them, again, is just tremendous. So we, again, we were, I guess, one of the earlier ones to put the toe in the water in terms of a public secure sub virtual LAN for IaaS. And again, we wanted to do it to our satisfaction in terms of the sensitivity of the data. And I think, again, the guidelines that are also coming out of this are very helpful. They have been helpful in terms of how to look at the separation of duties and the roles and responsibilities based on the different models, IaaS, PaaS, software as a service, have been very helpful in terms of structuring our continuous monitoring and the initial CNA of those systems.
Jim?
Yeah, Colleen, did you identify your cloud provider? Did I miss that?
I did not. I purposely did not.
Let me ask a follow-on question. Is your contract and SLA with appropriate redaction available to other government agencies?
I will look into that. It is, we're writing actually a contract via our Department of Transportation, so we're a writer on that contract.
Yeah, if I may, a lot of those SLAs can be procurement sensitive, so organizations are at some point, at a point, reluctant to share them. GSA has done, I think, a fantastic job of making a lot of that language available. If you go to their cloud computing PMO site, they have a library of case studies that are there, and a lot of that contract language is available to sort of look at if you're thinking of getting a feel for how some of that stuff is written. But I think federally, across the federal government, we're doing a much better job of beginning to share that information. Again, I think, obviously they're still in some modifications phases, and you're not going to get a whole lot out of organizations at that point, but for obvious reasons. But most of them are doing a pretty good job of sharing that information. I know that we are at conference.
Let's start over here and go down the road.
Yeah, regarding the drivers that help you to choose your cloud provider, there are a number of providers out there. Can you speak on that?
I'm going to sort of defer to Colleen since she's really done that. I mean, I've done, from a guidance perspective, we talked about that quite a bit in the 296 document. But it really does depend on your own environment and your requirements.
Well, I would say that our cloud provider was an identified public provider that was named in our department's Federal Data Center Consolidation Initiative. So we as a sub-agency of DOT really moved forward on our department's recommendation for this cloud provider. And they, of course, had criteria, evaluation criteria. Our department has their web presence at this vendor's facility. We also have, in addition to the infrastructure as a service cloud procurement, we also have a GFE colo rack at this facility. So I'm sorry I can't provide more information than that. I really was not involved with the selection criteria for this vendor, but it was a named facility in our data center consolidation plan.
You know, I'd also add that it really does depend on what it is that your organization is seeking cloud services for. And what I mean by that is if it's a low-hanging fruit, collaboration services or email or something like that. I mean, obviously, all the major cloud vendors offer pretty good services in that regard. But you know, I think it's important to always keep in mind that, you know, when you're procuring cloud services, you don't have to choose one cloud vendor. I mean, it's certainly probably advantageous to have a very hybrid environment where you may get infrastructure services from one vendor and software services from another. So I think that's just important to remember. And I hate to say it again, but it really does go back to developing, you know, a sound set of requirements and shopping those requirements with a wide variety of cloud providers.
If it's a known commodity, if the vendor's a known commodity within the agency, certainly you got a couple of steps ahead on the process because they already demonstrated their ability to do certain things. But again, the strategy in terms of your push to the cloud, whether it's public, private, hybrid, whether there could be special security requirements that may exceed the known commodity. My preference is always, if you know a source and they've demonstrated that they can provide security at a high level, and they're doing it in good faith, and if they don't mind bringing bad news to the table, then clearly that's going to be very helpful. Foreseeability is important. Again, going back to that multidisciplinary team, there's no crystal ball in this stuff, and it's still evolving. Cloud, there's a lot of issues associated with the cloud. FedRAMP's going to help in a lot of areas, but it does require that demonstrated due diligence early on, asking questions and trying to foresee what could happen. The what ifs, that's what's important, not what's happened in the past, but what could happen in the future, and then document that in your agreement.
Got a question there, Carrie?
This question is for Fred. Coming from this, what role do you see standards having in enabling and protecting information sharing in the cloud? And the panel talked about the importance of having the right language in service level agreements and contracts. How do you think standards need to be addressed?
Well, first of all, I don't really work in the standards arena. Remember, that is a very small group within this who does that, and that is a particular expertise. But I will say that, I think in the development of the technology roadmap, I think they identified 4 different security-related requirements, some of which were critically important. I can't really speak, in too much detail about. I'm not even familiar with what the standard was. Now it's escaping me for some reason. But in any event, it was the ability to take to take virtual instances and move them securely. Obviously, that's something that's critically important to cloud environments. In such a highly mobile environment, Jerry mentioned international data locations and so on and so forth. That kind of stuff is obviously very important. So, those types of standards and the development are going to move cloud forward, pretty rapidly. That's pretty much all I can say about it. But with regard to contract language, I don't think that at an operational level is going to push standards development as much as the communication between vendors and how they offer and develop solutions. You see what I mean? Of course, that's driven by our requirements as customers, but I think that the vendor community and how they offer and how they develop these solutions and service offerings, it really drives that a lot more. You see what I mean? And I think we develop our requirements based on what those standards look like. So it's sort of cyclic, but yeah.
With respect to privacy, NIST has special publication 800-144. I've studied it carefully, guidelines on privacy as well as security. I think it's a good document. They essentially try to foresee what could go wrong, provide a solution for that, but it's not prescriptive. It requires, going back to that due diligence, the customer, the organization, looking at that document and trying to assess what would apply. I mean, we're probably at the point now that 800-144 needs to be revised because we're learning as we go. And when they created that document, it's what they knew at the time. It's constantly changing. But I would certainly say if you're a customer on the federal side, you're looking at pushing to the cloud, certainly 800-144 is a good story. It's guidance, it's not prescriptive. And you got to translate that into contract clauses, but it's a good starting point.
Great. Darius?
Yes, each of the panel members mentioned about the 853 controls. In consideration of going to a cloud environment, that trust issue again, one of the controls, of course, is reviewing the physical security due diligence, John mentioned. And when we were considering going to a cloud environment versus keeping it in-house, the service providers that we were considering are very close with being able to share for purposes for their internal security and also their legal issues, allowing you to actually see what that virtual environment is. So how do you get over that, the actual virtualization issues, and actually being able to see what you're getting when the service providers in some cases are not allowing you to actually go to the sites where the virtual environment may be. So that's a big concern. And then what happened was we went did our due diligence and found that we felt comfortable we weren't allowed to see what we were actually getting. So I just wondered if the panelists said come back consideration.
Sure. I think I mentioned a cloud vendor I said a year or 6 hours. Right. That was one of the things that they mentioned. No, you can't visit the site. And thinking about it from their perspective, if they have, just 30,000 customers right there in the area, right? I mean, how do they accommodate that kind of thing? Individuals coming in to do physical audits, on the facilities. I mean, that could get to be very common. So, in some ways, you have to. You have to sort of balance the entire risk-based approach in that while you may not be able to do that with FedRAMP being launched, you can review packages and see how vendors have really addressed some of the controls that relate to how individuals are vetted, what kind of security clearances or backgrounds or background checks these individuals are getting, and so on and so forth. So I guess in short, I would say that the FedRAMP program is intended to address those kinds of needs for large groups, right? Certified once and used by many, and that is the approach. And while some federal managers may be a little uncomfortable with that, that is our reality, and that is the reality of taking that kind of a risk-based approach. You're not going to have detailed access to the kinds of information that you may want to see. Colleen mentioned continuous monitoring, sort of the same thing. You may not be able to get log data. How do they feed log data to that many people? What do you do? Make it available on some website? Of course not. I mean, obviously you can't do that. So how do you go about that? Well, you may have to deal with the fact that you get to see a red, yellow, green. Okay, we're helping today. We have a slight problem today, or hurry up and get your data out of here. I mean, really. But obviously, you're not going to have the same level of granularity that you do currently. But of course, obviously, we all know that there are many problems with the way that we conduct IT now in our current environment.
We have time for one final question. But don't be shy.
I have a question. With regards to vetting those applications applicable for the cloud, my understanding not all applications that we're aware of are capable of being in the cloud. Does anybody have a matrix or some type of methodology that they're currently using that could be shared with regards to which application is more applicable to the cloud environment than others?
We have a matrix that we used within NHTSA, and I'd be happy to share it. So it had criteria. Obviously, we looked at the sensitivity of the data. We looked at the fluctuation, for example, of the transactions. So if it was, like in the case of our online complaint system, that would be an example where when we're in the news for a certain vehicle defect, we see an increase, obviously, in owners of that manufactured vehicle hitting our website to submit online complaint data. Not saying that that's one because of the sensitivity that we would put in the cloud, but that's an example where you want on-demand scalability. So we did use some methodology to determine, in conjunction with our data center consolidation transition plan, where we see which applications might be more beneficial to move to a public cloud, and then as there are going to be more private cloud vendors available, federally owned and, federally managed, then we're looking at potentially moving some of those systems out of our virtualized environment to a larger federally managed cloud environment.
Did you mean that from a security perspective, or were you just asking sort of?
No, in general.
In general. Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to sound like a Vivek Kundra disciple here, but I mean, quite frankly, I think, no, I really do believe that the cloud first policy is extremely well warranted. I mean, I think we should all be looking at deploying any new projects or applications, even on some of our legacy stuff. Virtualization is not new, so we've been using virtualization for quite some time. So
I understand that, but what happens is you're still talking about, well, with regards to NASA, you're talking about ITAR data. With regards to a lot of the different agencies, you're talking about the level of as far as risk level is concerned, and you're also talking about the capability of the cloud handling certain applications at this time. I know within NASA we have looked at several different cloud providers, and they have also informed us that all applications at this time is not readily available to go into the cloud because of their limitation of resources. So I'm saying right now there is a vetting process that needs to go on, and as a result of that, I just want to kind of understand what type of vetting processes some other agencies may be deploying in order to decide which application will first move over to the cloud.
So I mentioned the technology roadmap earlier. That was developed in conjunction with academia and scientific community representatives. So you know, obviously, I mean, I'm well aware that the cloud has its limitations right now. I mean, from a compute perspective, there are some limitations. But I would say that I think for general computing needs across, you know, most federal agencies, unless you have something that is, you know, esoteric, geospatial type application, scientific, I would say you'd probably be very well served or better served looking at cloud implementation.
And this final question actually dovetails nicely into the next session we're having here, which is about are we ready to move mission critical apps to the cloud? I know you mentioned, you know, kind of low hanging fruit, but now we're talking about some more intense applications with some very sensitive data, and we're going to have a very fascinating discussion next on that. So with that, I want to thank my panelists. Thank you for being here. And thank you all for the fantastic questions. We have a 15-minute break. As I mentioned in here, we have a session called Are You Ready to Move Mission Critical Apps to the Cloud? Up in the Buchanan, we have Anatomy of a Web Application Attack, How to Prevent the Resume Generating Events. Thank you.